My name is Claire Harmon, and the night everything broke open started with my mother laughing at me across a dinner table set with the good china. I was 19 years old. My acceptance letter to the nursing program at Creighton sat on the counter behind her, and she hadn't touched it once. She'd read the name on the envelope, set it down like it was a piece of junk mail, and gone back to refilling everyone's water glasses. When my father finally asked what it said, she answered for me. She said, "Claire wants to go wipe strangers for a living." Then she laughed, a short, bright little sound, like she'd just told the best joke of the year. My father shook his head slowly. He looked more disappointed than angry, which was somehow worse. He said, "I didn't raise you to aim at the floor." My brother didn't say anything. He just stared at his plate. That wasn't the first time they'd made it clear what they thought of my choices. But something about that night, the good china, the laughing, the way my mother said wipe strangers like it, explained everything about my worth, made something in my chest go quiet in a way it never had before. Not numb, just decided. 2 weeks later, I found out they had already transferred the money they'd been setting aside for my education into my brother's law school fund. Nobody told me. I found the paperwork by accident, tucked behind the electric bill in a kitchen drawer I was looking through for a pen. The account was listed in both their names, and the memo on the transfer said simply, "Daniel Fall Semester." My name was nowhere on it. It had never been anywhere on it. I didn't make a scene. I folded the paper back the way I'd found it, put it in the drawer, and spent the next 3 days figuring out how to leave. On a Tuesday morning in October, while my parents were at work and my brother was at a campus visit, I packed 2 bags, called the one friend from high school who'd moved into an apartment near the university, and left the house in Omaha where I'd grown up. I didn't leave a note. I'd spent 19 years talking and not being heard. A note felt like more talking. For the next several months, I slept on my friend's couch, worked double shifts at a diner on weekdays, and took out every loan I qualified for to cover what my parents had never planned to give me anyway. I started nursing school in January, 1 semester late, which meant I was already behind before I'd taken a single class. I studied on lunch breaks, in parking lots, in the laundry room of the apartment building at midnight because the fluorescent light in there never went out and my friend needed to sleep. My mother called twice in the first year. Once to tell me I was being dramatic. Once to tell me my grandmother had asked about me at Christmas and it was embarrassing. I didn't call back either time. Eventually the calls stopped, and after a while I stopped checking whether they had. The years that followed were not easy, but they were mine. I graduated, passed my boards, and took a position at Nebraska Medical Center on a cardiac step-down unit. I worked nights for 3 years because the differential helped me pay off loans faster, and because there's something clarifying about 3 a.m. The hospital quiets down, the work becomes very simple like whackum, and very serious, and you understand quickly whether you're actually good at something or just telling yourself you are. I found out I was good at it, not perfect. Good in the way that matters, where patients remember your name and ask for you specifically, where other nurses come to you when something doesn't look right and they can't say why yet. By 26, I'd moved to a cardiac ICU. By 28, I was charge nurse on the day shift, which meant I was the one making the calls when things went sideways, the one the doctors called first when they wanted a reliable read on a patient, the one orienting new staff and telling them the same thing I'd had to teach myself, that being underestimated is not the same as being wrong. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from the hospital. I had a cat named Voltage, a coffee maker I treated better than most appliances, and a calendar that was mostly full of work and a standing Saturday morning run with my friend Deb, who'd been my couch for those first hard months, and had since become the kind of person I would do almost anything for. My life looked smaller from the outside than it felt from the inside. That's the thing about building something yourself, brick by brick, shift by shift. It gets a particular texture that you can't really explain to someone who's never had to do it that way. I had not spoken to my parents in 9 years. I had thought about them, of course. You don't just switch off 9 years of a family, even a family that made you feel like a punchline. Some nights I'd catch myself wondering whether they'd softened, whether distance had given them any perspective, whether my mother had ever replayed that dinner and heard herself the way I'd heard her. But wondering is not the same as hoping, and I'd learned the difference a long time ago. My brother and I were somewhere in between, estranged, and just quiet. We'd exchanged a handful of texts over the years. Birthday acknowledgments mostly. He'd sent a short message when I graduated. I'd sent one when I heard through an old mutual friend that his first marriage had fallen apart. We didn't call each other. There was too much history between us that neither of us knew how to carry. The first sign that something was shifting came on a Wednesday afternoon in March, when I was in the middle of charting after a long morning. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and when I let it go to voicemail, the message that came back was my brother's voice. He sounded tired. He said, "Hey, it's Daniel. I know this is out of nowhere. It's about Dad. Can you call me back?" He left the number again, even though it was already in my call log. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. I want to tell you I called back immediately, that some deep and unconditional love kicked in and overrode everything else, but that's not what happened. What happened was I sat there for 40 minutes, finished my charting, got a cup of coffee, and then sat down again and thought about what I actually wanted to do with this information. Not what I was supposed to do. What I wanted. I called him back that evening from my car in the hospital parking garage. He picked up on the first ring. He said Dad had been admitted to a hospital in Omaha 3 days ago. A heart attack, moderate, caught in time, but the cardiology team wanted to observe him longer because there were some things on his EKG that made them uneasy. My mother was there. She was, according to my brother, holding it together on the outside and falling apart on the inside. The way she'd always done, performing composed for anyone watching while privately spinning out. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked. "They think so," Daniel said. "But Claire, there's something else." A pause. "Mom wants you to come." I waited. "She called me to have me ask you," he said. "She said she couldn't call herself. That she didn't know if you'd pick up." "She would have been right," I said. Another pause. "I know. I'm not calling to guilt you. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know what's happening, and I think you deserve to decide what to do with it yourself. Not because she wants something." That was more than I'd expected from him. I told him I'd think about it. He said okay. And then, before I could hang up, he said one more thing. He said, "For what it's worth, I've been thinking a lot lately about what it was like growing up. For you, specifically. I don't know how to say this right, but I don't think I understood it at the time, and I think I should have." I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked him for calling, and ended the call and sat in my car in the parking garage for another 20 minutes with the engine off. I'm going to tell you what I ended up deciding, but before I do that, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are, and what country are you watching from? I want to see how far this one travels. I did not go to Omaha. Not that week. What I did instead was call Deb and ask her to come over, and she showed up 45 minutes later with a paper bag of Indian food, and the kind of expression that meant she already knew something had happened. I walked her through the phone call, my brother's voice, the request from my mother delivered through a middleman because she couldn't make it herself. Deb listened all the way through without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she asked me the same question she'd asked me once before about something totally different. "What do you actually want? Not what you're supposed to want. You." I said. "I want to know that she's capable of saying she was wrong without needing something from me first." Deb was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she is?" I shook my head. "I don't know. That's the problem." We ate our food, and she stayed until almost midnight, and by the time she left, I hadn't decided anything except that I wasn't going to let someone else's emergency become my obligation by default. That's not the same as not caring. It took me years to understand that, but I understand it now. Caring about someone, and agreeing to be used by them, are two completely different things. 2 days later, my brother called again. He said Dad was being transferred. The cardiology team in Omaha had consulted with a larger center and decided they wanted a more specialized team handling his care going forward. They were moving him to Nebraska Medical Center, to my hospital. I found out on a Thursday morning when I arrived for my shift and pulled up the new admission list. Room 14. I stared at the name for long enough that the nurse coming off nights asked me if something was wrong. I said no, just tired. I handed off 2 patients, clocked in, and went to find my manager. I told her the situation plainly. Incoming cardiac patient, my estranged father, 9 years no contact, complicated history. I told her I didn't think it was appropriate for me to be assigned to his room, and I wanted to flag it now, rather than have it become a problem later. She thanked me for telling her immediately, reassigned his room to another charge nurse, and made a note in the file. She said, "Is there anything else you need from us?" I said no. She said, "Let me know if that changes." That's the thing about building a professional life somewhere for years. People trust your word. They don't need the backstory. They just need to know you're handling it honestly, and when you have, they move on. I went back to my unit and had the most regular Wednesday of my career. I found out through my brother that my father had arrived, been settled, and that my mother had taken up her post in the waiting area down the hall. She hadn't asked to speak to me. He'd told her I worked there. She'd gone quiet, he said, for a very long time. I worked my shifts and stayed out of room 14. I ran my unit. I taught a new nurse how to read a rhythm strip she kept second-guessing herself on. I went home, fed voltage, slept 6 hours, came back. My job was my job, and I was good at it. And I let myself lean on that while the rest of it sat in the background like a sound you're aware of but not yet ready to turn toward. On Friday afternoon, my mother found me. I was walking back from the supply room when I turned a corner and she was standing 10 feet away, looking smaller than I remembered, in a blue cardigan that was slightly too big for her, her hands folded in front of her the way people fold their hands when they're not sure what else to do with them. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. Neither of us moved. She looked older. That was the first thing, before anything else. The lines around her mouth were deeper. Her hair was more silver than I remembered. She looked like someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was very tired, and I noticed that, and I also noticed that noticing it didn't undo everything else. "Claire," she said. I said, "You can't be in this area without a badge escort. I can have someone take you back to the waiting room. I just needed to see you." "I know," I said, "but this is my workplace, and there are rules here that don't care about our history. Come with me, and I'll have someone walk you back." She started to say something and stopped. I think she'd expected something different from me, maybe anger, maybe tears, maybe some version of the daughter she'd known at 19 who could be moved by a look or a certain tone of voice. What she got instead was someone who worked here and knew the layout and was not going to have this conversation in a hallway. I called a patient liaison to escort her back to the family waiting area, told my mother I would come find her before my shift ended, and went back to work. My hands were steady. Years of handling things that mattered under pressure had made sure of that. When my shift ended at 7, I changed out of my scrubs, put on the plain clothes I'd arrived in, and walked to the family waiting room. My mother was in a chair by the window. My brother was there too, sitting across from her, and he stood when he saw me in a way that told me he'd been hoping I would actually show up and wasn't certain I would. I sat down. I did not hug either of them. I folded my hands in my own lap and waited. My mother looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You work here." "I've worked here for 5 years." "I didn't know that." "There's a lot you don't know," I said. Not unkindly. Just factually. She looked down at her hands. There was a particular silence that followed, the kind that happens when someone has rehearsed something and finds, in the actual moment, that none of it fits. Finally she said, "Your father's going to need cardiac rehab, probably a long course of it. And the house, we never really planned for." She stopped. Started again. "We're not in a position the way we used to be. Things have been harder." His business slowed down, and we refinanced twice, and I thought Daniel would be closer by now, but, "Mom," I said. She looked up. "What do you need?" She exhaled, something between a breath and a surrender. "We need help, financially, and with arrangements. If your father qualifies for a supplemental program, someone with a stable income and clean credit would need to vouch for the household." The financial counselor mentioned it. I just thought, since you're here, and since you have your career, I let her finish. I didn't interrupt. When she was done, I sat with it for a moment. So, let me understand this, I said quietly. You found out I work here, in the hospital where Dad was transferred, and the first thing you came to say to me is that you need a financial co-signature. I came to see you, she said. The rest came out because I'm scared and I don't know how to just sit with you without trying to solve something at the same time. That was the most honest thing she'd said to me in possibly ever, and I noted it without letting it do all the work she probably hoped it would do. I've spent 9 years solving things on my own, I told her. The same 9 years you spent not calling. Not once did either of you call to ask how I was. Not when I graduated. Not when I got this job. Not when you just needed to say something. I kept my voice even. I'm not saying this to punish you. I'm saying it so that you understand why you're being scared right now doesn't automatically become my emergency. My mother's eyes filled. I know we weren't. I know we weren't fair to you. I've thought about it. When? I asked. Before Dad got sick, or after? She didn't answer. That was its own kind of answer. Daniel had been quiet through all of this, and now he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked at our mother, and then at me, and he said something I hadn't expected him to say. He said, I want to tell Claire what I know. About the money. My mother stiffened. Daniel. She deserves to know, he said. She probably already knows most of it, but she should hear it from me. He turned to face me. They didn't just move the education fund. There was a savings account in your name, from Grandma, set up when you were born. Mom closed it when you were 17. Used it to cover a home equity thing they'd overextended on. He paused. I found out 2 years ago, going through some old paperwork when Dad needed help with his taxes. I confronted them. They told me it was a family decision, and that you'd left anyway so it didn't matter. His voice was flat, but not cold. Just exhausted. I should have called you then. I didn't. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. The room was quiet. I thought about 17-year-old me, and 19-year-old me, and the years of loans and night shifts and parking lots with textbooks on my steering wheel. I thought about the account I didn't even know had ever existed. I appreciate you telling me, I said. And I meant it. Then I looked at my mother. I'm not going to co-sign anything, I said. I'm not going to vouch for a financial arrangement with my name and my credit. Not because I want to watch you suffer, because I built what I have by taking on no debt I couldn't control, and I'm not changing that for a situation I didn't create. I held her gaze. What I will do is this. Before I leave tonight, I'll talk to the social work team here. They specialize in exactly these situations, families managing long-term cardiac care without adequate planning. They know every program, every assistance option, every resource that exists. I'll make the introduction myself and make sure they give you a real consultation. My mother blinked. She'd been braced for something else. That's all I have to offer right now, I said. It's real, and it's useful, and it comes without strings. But I need you to hear me when I tell you that it's not a doorway back to everything being fine between us. That's a different conversation, and it doesn't happen in a waiting room while Dad is on a monitor down the hall. I stood up. I'll go find the social worker now. I walked to the door, and then stopped. I turned back, because there was one more thing. The thing you said at dinner, I said to my mother, about wiping strangers. She went very still. I've saved lives in this building. I've held people's hands when their families couldn't get there in time. I've been the last calm voice a person heard before a procedure they were terrified of. And every single one of those people was a stranger to you. I let that sit. So yes. I wipe strangers. I'm very, very good at it. I left the waiting room and went to find the social work team. The days that followed were strange, in the way that only emotional reckoning can be strange. The surface was normal. My shifts, my routines, my coffee, my cat, but underneath, something had shifted and was still settling, the way a building settles after something big moves through it. I kept working. I kept showing up. I spoke to my brother 3 more times that week. Not about our parents, really. Just about him. About what the last few years had looked like from his side, what he'd figured out, and what he was still working on. He told me he'd started therapy after his marriage ended. He said the therapist kept asking him about our childhood, and he'd kept saying it was fine, until one day he realized fine was the word he used for things he hadn't examined yet. I told him I understood that. We didn't fix everything in a week of phone calls. That's not how it works. But we started something that felt real, and that was enough. My father was discharged 11 days after his transfer. He and my mother went home to Omaha with a cardiac rehab plan, a new medication schedule, and an appointment set up through the hospital's social work team with a financial counselor who specialized in long-term care planning for older adults. I heard this from the nurse who'd handled his discharge. I hadn't gone to see him. I'd thought about it every day, and I hadn't gone, and I was honest with myself about why. I wasn't ready, and more importantly, he hadn't asked. My mother had reached out through my brother once more, a message that said simply, "Your father wanted me to tell you thank you for the social work referral. He knows what it cost you." I read it twice and didn't respond. I wasn't sure yet what response I had. The season changed. I kept running Saturday mornings with Deb. Voltage developed an opinion about mornings that I found deeply relatable. I took on a mentorship role at the hospital for new nurses coming out of the accelerated program, which meant I met a lot of 22 and 23-year-olds who were exhausted and unsure and trying very hard, and something about spending time with them made me understand my own history a little differently. When you watch someone new wrestle with the gap between who they thought they'd be and who the work is actually making them, you recognize the shape of it. I started something small that spring. I reached out to the financial aid office at Creighton, the nursing school I'd attended, and asked about the process for establishing a small scholarship fund. Not large, not named after anyone famous, just a supplemental award for students in the nursing program who had demonstrated and ever worries, had a history of supporting themselves without family assistance, students who were doing it the hard way. The first year, we funded 2 awards. In the application, I added one required essay question. It asked, "Describe a moment when someone told you that the path you chose wasn't worth taking. What did you decide to do next? And what did that choice teach you about the kind of care provider you want to be?" I read every response myself. I want to say something before I go, because I think it's the thing I actually needed to hear when I was 19 years old with 2 bags and nowhere specific to go. Being told you've aimed too low is often just someone else's discomfort with your independence wearing the costume of concern. The people who loved me conditionally didn't stop being my parents. They just stopped being the final word on what I was worth. Those are 2 different things, and you're allowed to hold them both at the same time. I don't know where my relationship with my parents ends up. My mother sent a card at Christmas. I sent one back. My father called once, in January, and left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and covered about 15 years of things he hadn't said. I listened to it 3 times and I haven't called back yet. I might. I'm still figuring out what I want that to look like, and I've learned that figuring out what you want is not selfish. It's the work. What I know is this: I am a nurse in a cardiac ICU. I keep people's hearts beating on the worst days of their lives. I do it with my hands and my training and years of showing up when it would have been easier not to. Nobody gave me that. Nobody can take it back. If you grew up in a house where your choices were treated like embarrassments, I want you to know that the path you chose because it was yours, not because anyone approved of it, is the path that will hold you. Other people's disappointment in you is information about them. What you decide to do with your one life is information about you. Tell me in the comments. What's one thing you were told you couldn't do that you ended up doing anyway? I'd genuinely love to know. Because here's what I believe. From 9 years of working in a room where everything that matters gets very clear, very fast. You don't need the people who underestimated you to revise their opinion of you. You just need to outlast it. From where I'm standing, that's not a consolation prize. That's the whole point.